Well, I've talked about my top 10 Pixar films of all time, and now there are only 5 Pixar films left. So by default, these are my 5 worst Pixar films of all time. But in all honesty, out of these 5 films, there's only one film truly worthy of being considered worst of Pixar. And I think you can probably guess what that is. The other 4 movies in this category all have 3 stars or higher for me. So just because they're on the worst list doesn't actually mean I consider them bad films. It just means that they are the worst of Pixar. That's what they are. At least in my opinion. So let's start off with the number 5 worst Pixar film in my opinion, and it's a film that I still really enjoyed. I still would give it roughly 4 stars, but at the same time it's one of the most mediocre Pixar film, and it's one of the most forgettable of these 5 films that I'm about to talk about, and that is Brave. Yes, I still had a fun time in the theater. There were still moments that I was a little surprised were actually in a Pixar film because I felt they were definitely more adult-rated humor, but there were some moments where I was surprised they got away with. I'm a big fantasy fan, so it was set in a medieval Scotland, and there was magic involved, and it did remind me a little bit of Brother Bear because of the whole transformation sequences. And now overall I was still a little disappointed because I wasn't sure what to expect. The trailers made me think it was going to be some big adventure and her running away and stuff, and we don't really get that in Brave, but I still enjoyed it. I was still a little surprised by it, but overall a little disappointed, and it's my 5th worst Pixar film. So number 12 is another pretty disappointing film, especially since the first one is among my top 6, and that is Monsters University. Yes, I still liked it. It was a little interesting to see how Mike and Sully got to be where they were and how they started off as enemies to become friends, and the whole college scenario. It still was pretty interesting, and it was different because they ended up getting expelled anyway, and they had to work up the ladder to end up being the best scarer of the company. At the same time, it did feel a little too cliched in the fact that it felt like other college-related movies, and there wasn't really too much different about it, and I don't know, it was just a little bit lagging. Now my number 3 worst Pixar film is probably going to be really surprising, and it's probably going to be blasphemous for having anything from this trilogy in the worst. But I gotta say, the most disappointing of the Toy Story franchise was Toy Story 2 for me. Now don't get me wrong, I still like it. It's still about 3.5 star worthy for me. But overall, I remember when I was a kid watching it, and I was disappointed then, and I'm still a little disappointed. But number 2 for me wasn't as fun and wasn't as entertaining as number 1 was for me. Yes, it had a great and tragic backstory for Jessie, and it did tug on my heartstrings. And it was so successful that they ripped it off in Toy Story 3. But overall, that's the only thing about Toy Story 2 that I can remember very clearly. The rest of it is just sort of eh. Plus, I think the issues in Toy Story and Toy Story 3 could be a little bit more relatable and not just toy-related. Like, you can implicate them in a real-life scenario rather than just in a toy scenario. And number 2, it's mainly just a toy scenario, which I like and was interesting because it's another aspect of toys you don't really think about, but at the same time, it wasn't as relatable and it wasn't as good for me. Okay, so if you've seen my top 10 of Pixar films and you've just got to this point in my video now, then you will know what the last 2 remaining Pixar films are, and I think a lot of people agree that they are the 2 worst of Pixar films. And for me, the first one I still like. It's still a 3-star movie for me, but overall it is the most average of the Pixar franchise, and that is Cars. I think the story was still good, it was still interesting, the characters I could still like. It was still weird having a whole world where cars talked and did jobs and all this weird stuff. But overall, Cars was still entertaining, it was still fun, but it's not as great as everything else that Pixar has done. Now, I don't think I have to talk too much about this film because many people agree this is the worst Pixar film, and I have to agree with them. This is the worst Pixar film, and it's really the only Pixar film that I actually dislike, to the point where I would honestly give this maybe a half a star at most. Yeah, everything else Pixar has done is 3 stars or more for me. But Cars 2, that's a half a star. It was a sequel to their most mediocre Pixar film that they have, and it really was unnecessary. The whole spy thing, and what is it, Larry the Cable Guy's character, was it Motor, or I don't even remember, but that whole thing was just, it was lame, and I get what they're going for it, and I think there's something to commemorate it for, with the relationship between him and his best friend, but at the same time, I don't know, it was really terrible for me. So yeah, Cars 2, easily the worst Pixar film, and I can't talk about the Planes ones because they're not even Pixar films, they're just Disney films, so I'm glad I don't even have to talk about those films. I haven't seen the first Planes, but I saw Planes, Fire and Rescue, and that was really lame. So that is my top 5 worst Pixar films of all time, and what is your worst? I'm sure it's Cars 2, but who knows, it could be something else. I wouldn't blame you, so maybe even like Cars 2. Please don't like Cars 2. But as always, this is Bruce Gifford, and this was Just My Opinion.